honor and pleasure to welcome you to the session Building Evidence for Impact and Scale, co-hosted by the Nudge Institute. I'd like you to join me in welcoming. This will be a panel discussion, so I'd like you to please warmly welcome the panel. I'll introduce them one by one. So first, we have Shobhini Mukherjee, Executive Director, JPAL South Asia. Please give a warm round of applause. Shobhini Mukherjee is the Executive Director, JPAL of South Asia, overseeing partnerships and evidence-driven initiatives that scale impactful policy solutions. She is recognized for pioneering rigorous evaluations in education and livelihoods, advancing programs now reaching over 60 million children and millions of women across Asia and Africa. Thank you, Shobhini ma'am. Next, we have Abhishek Sharma, Senior Manager, ID Insight, leading high-impact research and advisory projects with state governments and philanthropies. With over 12 years in public policy, implementation, and evaluation, including work with NRLM and multilaterals, he turns evidence into better outcomes for development programs. Thank you, Abhishek. Do please welcome him. Bidisha Barua from 3IE. She leads evaluation. She's a lead evaluation specialist and leader gender and livelihoods at 3IE. She leads 3IE's work on rural livelihoods and gender with over 12 years of impact evaluation experience in developing countries. She specializes in advancing evidence and capacity for gender equality and women's empowerment, and has recently led 3IE's evaluation of NRLM and oversees a global portfolio on women's economic resilience. Welcome, Bidisha. Last but not the least, I'd like to invite the moderator, Prakash Kumar, Senior Manager at the Nudge Institute. He leads the impact team for the Economic Inclusion Program at the Nudge. Welcome, Prakash. I'll hand it over to Prakash. Take it forward.
Thanks, Sri. It's my pleasure in welcoming all of you, the panelists, especially for this panel discussion on building evidence for impact and scale. Globally, when we look at economic inclusion programs, we see that especially when these programs are participatory and community driven, we see that it works in spite of challenges like the pandemic or through shocks like the climate shocks. It's still working. In fact, the recent report by the State of Economic Inclusion 2024 says that the spread of economic inclusion program right now has reached close to 70 million people spread across 88 different countries. That in itself talks about the scale at which this economic inclusion programs have scaled. Having said that, the scale that we are talking about is nowhere close to the global need. Just yesterday we were discussing about where Smriti Sharan ma'am mentioned about the number of people in India who are most excluded. I mean, the estimate right now is somewhere around 30 million. That in itself talks about the opportunity for bringing millions of people out of the most excluded category, as well as the challenges that it holds in terms of executing this. For today's discussion, we have representatives from JPAL, ID Insight, and 3IE, and we are going to hear leading perspectives on evidence generation, and all three organizations have immense capabilities and governments. Now, the evidence is clear. When government uses rigorous evidence-backed design and partnering with, say, NGOs and private sector to execute programs, the outcomes are robust, they are resilient. So this is clear. But when we talk about scale it's not just replication, there is a difference. Scale also involves ensuring that we are adapting, we are learning iteratively, we are collaborating with different sectors, we are understanding the context. So it is complex, to put it mildly. And that's what the discussions is going to be on. And we have organizations who have demonstrated that yes, scale is possible. Um, and we're going to hear their perspectives on what have been their learnings and the opportunities as well as the challenges that it holds and what more can be done on this. Um, I'll start off this discussion by requesting all the panelists to share their opening remarks on what you think. Sorry, is it audible? Yeah. So, how do you see evidence building influencing the government to adapt and scale economic inclusion programs? And if you can reference this with an example that your organization has executed and worked with. So I'll request all of you to just share your perspectives.
Prakash, you're asking someone who generates evidence to give one example in 2 minutes. I shall try, but given that it's an economic inclusion program, I'll talk about one of our most talked about and remarkable programs that we have evaluated in the last, say, 15 years or 16 years. But if I were to give you some, I mean, and a lot of folks in the audience have a lot of experience now working with governments, but there are a few important lessons that we've learned, and I can try and talk through very quickly with this one example. When you're trying to work with governments in influencing the decision making based on evidence, the evidence in a way de-risks their political and financial decisions. Because when you have evidence backing a decision, there's a lot more confidence that this will work. The graduation approach is one example that I want to talk about here today, which has gone through many iterations and has been adapted to different contexts. Now, I'm sure a lot of people in this attending the conclave will know what the graduation approach is, but if I were to talk about it in a nutshell, it's essentially a livelihoods program for extreme poor families who are not able to save even 5 or 10 rupees in a social savings group, a self-help savings group. They're not able, they skip meals, they don't eat every day, they have one meal today, they might skip tomorrow, they'll have a meal the day after. Very, very poor living conditions, kids most likely not going to school, women-headed households with no male earning member. Now, it's a family of 5 or 6. And the cycle repeats itself. What the graduation approach does is it gives an asset to these families, to these women. Most of these women would be semi-literate or illiterate. So you're giving them an asset, giving them some consumption support, but you're also then hand-holding them, giving them some amount of training, coaching on bookkeeping, but also everything from literacy to sanitation to education. It's a combined package. And it's been transformational in the kind of results that we've seen. There was concurrently, and very fortunately, there was a randomized evaluation across about 7 countries across the world. This has been pioneered by BRAC in Bangladesh. So it was evaluated in Bangladesh, it was evaluated in India. At the same time, in 2002, evaluated through randomized controlled trials in Ghana, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Honduras, Peru, Ethiopia, I think one or two other countries. And we found consistently across all these 7 evaluations and randomized evaluations that the results sustained. We found that not only were families being able to use these assets productively, they were saving better, they were eating better, they were saving more, they were eating better, kids were going to school, and they were able to diversify their enterprises. So they were, again, being a part of the social security net, they were able to now access better market linkages, better financial products. So this has been very transformational in the work now that we're doing in India with the Poverty Action Lab in collaboration with governments, because all of these evaluations were done in the implementation was done in partnership with non-profits. In India, the very first evaluation that we've done in a government setup was with Jivika in Bihar through the SJY program. We are at the end line stage now. We've got initial results, very promising. Results have sustained across all dimensions that I spoke about, whether it's consumption, savings, as well as diversification of assets and the market linkages that we are seeing, but also self-confidence of these women. This has given now the government of India a lot more impetus and the emphasis on being able to use these results to create a nationwide scheme. And it's not just alone the evidence alone coming together. A lot of actors have come together in this. BRAC is there, Nudge Institute is there, and there are an entire consortium of other nonprofits who are supporting this, including many donors who put their money into this. This is being done across 11 states in India. So this is one quick example of how it's not just the evidence, but this sort of co-creating this entire ecosystem, both from the community level to the top-down bureaucratic buy-in, political buy-in, and many actors coming together to create this, this momentum.
Thank you. So thinking about the same question, one example that comes to my mind is about ID Insight's work with the Nudge Institute. So as we all know that Nudge Institute is working on economic inclusion program. So it was running couple of pilots in 6 states for last couple of years, and ID Insight supported the institute in doing process evaluations in 2 of the states, in Assam and Tripura. Now, thinking about evidence and thinking about process evaluation, basically how we reflected on the decision centricity was around, that it will have design impact, it will help us understand about the implementation fidelity, about who are the people who are included, who are the people who are excluded, and why. So we brought that lens into the process evaluations, and one specific example that comes to my mind from Tripura was that the identification process was very rigorous. 5 days identification, 4-step, including social wealth ranking, including one survey which was called Powered Assessment Tool, then validation by village organization level, then approval by block level. Now, in Tripura, one peculiar thing is that people migrate for jhum cultivation, for agriculture. That led to a lot of, some amount of exclusion. Now, reflecting a little bit, no matter how rigorous our design is, no matter how rigorous our implementation is, there are local realities that have to be kept in mind. So we tried to capture those realities, and then brought them out, presented those to NRLM, to the Nudge Institute, so that they could be incorporated in the design going forward. Now that we have Samaveshi Ajivika Yojana, it is very exciting to see how the scale up is happening with a lot of hard work from different organizations, the Nudge Institute, BRAC, JPAL, ID Insights, all of them. So it has moved from the pilot stage to the scale up stage, and the journey still continues, and it's very exciting to see that.
So I want to talk a bit about the evaluation of NRLM and the 3IE conducted. There have been 2 rounds of this evaluation for those who may be new to it. One was conducted in 2019, and the other is more recent, conducted 2024. The reports, the first report is available online, the second is upcoming. So I'm going to just try to link what we are seeing both in both these evaluations. Well, the uniqueness of this evaluation was that it was an evaluation of a government program that was already being done at scale. Our evaluation covered 27,000 households across 9 states. There was a counterfactual. We used quasi-experimental methods with all the necessary checks and balances. The first evaluation, which was in 2019, was evaluating the program broadly, I think after maybe 7-8 years of the program. And we found that there was remarkable impact of the program and just also to step back in case there are people in this room who may not be fully aware of what the program is. Till 2019, when we were evaluating it, it was a credit program that was offering women small savings, small loans. But at the same time, there was also a move, at a very nascent state, to federate small self-help groups into broader federations. And, one thing that came to my mind over and over again when we were evaluating this program was something that I read a long time ago, that small groups of poor women are eventually poor groups. But if you bring together diverse women who may bring diverse skills across groups, then what you have is something more powerful. Um, the 2019 evaluation showed that NRLM, in its current form, did have impacts on women's income, which was which was really something that kind of sparked a lot of interest among policymakers. Um, but the program also showed, our evaluation also showed where the impacts were coming from. The impacts were really coming from the federation. When these women in small groups in pockets of the country were linked to other diverse women, and these federations were strengthened. Um, uh, and why were these federations so powerful? Because they were, after all, social networks of women. And they were, apart from social networks, they were also developing rural institutional capacity. The evaluation pointed out to these large findings in 2019. And this gave a lot of impetus, as Shobini has mentioned, that sometimes what the government needs is just that push. There's already the thinking of what can be done next, but they need this rigorous impact that says this is where you need to go. And the 2019 evaluation was able to do precisely that. It gave it emphasized the importance of the federations, these cluster level federations, the need to empower them. And, all of this was very part of the 2020, discussions around it. In 2024, when we went back, the National Rural Economic Transformation Project was implemented by MORD with support from the World Bank. And there was a tremendous focus on precisely, making these federations stronger, federations of women stronger, layering livelihoods programs. And programs in the forms of enterprise development. Another thing that our 2019 evaluation showed, that rural India is actually not that agrarian anymore. Their households are deriving incomes out of off-farm and non-farm incomes, and the importance of being able to tap onto that avenue as well. NRETP also built on that. We were able to give that precise evidence that was needed. 2024, when we did the evaluation, we find even tremendous impact. The 2019, we saw an impact of around 19% for the household in terms of household income. 2024, we see 23% increase, 24% increase in household income. That's a lot. And, so it's not only about telling an evaluation or evidence building to show impact. And as you have rightly mentioned, that it's also about the why, how, what's the lever. And, we pointed out to the need to build institutional capacity, the need to bring in, upskilling workers. All of these were part of the evaluation. And they really gave the government that incentive, that extra ammunition that is needed to bring this in forward. So I just also want to just take one more minute to say that building evidence is important, no doubt, but and that is why we are here, in this room. But I think also something that's important is to build the capacity of governments to be able to use the evidence effectively. And again, maybe for that we'll have a time for more discussion on that.
Thank you, Vidisha. A lot of interesting points have emerged. I'll touch upon one statement that ma'am made on evidence de-risks financial and political decision making. A very interesting point. Ma'am, I would like you to elaborate a little more on that from the perspective of what more is needed for different players to take evidence building a sustained priority. Well, it is clear that evidence building is happening. How do we ensure that it continues?
So firstly, I'll say that I have been in this field for 24, 25 years. I feel ancient. Evidence is not a priority for anyone. And this is something that is a good to have, but not necessary. So if we say necessary but not sufficient, it is actually not even, it's not top of mind for everybody. Now, in the last decade that I've been working a lot more with, I mean, I've been working with governments all my life, but I've seen a lot more of the interest to learn from evidence in the last decade and a half. It's also different kinds of evidence that you're learning from. So when you think about sustained priorities, it has to be something that speaks to everybody. It has to be meaningful. It has to, I mean, you really need to be able to integrate it and internalize it. It has to make sense to you. You have to act upon it. A lot of the evidence that we are generating ends up not being used. It ends up just lying in a folder somewhere in a file, and that is never going to get used. If I talk about the example of what has been different in the program evaluation of the Jivika program in Bihar with the government, they've been, other than the randomized evaluation that's going to tell you what the impacts are in the most rigorous and causal manner, and what works and why and for whom, there are 2-3 aspects, and I think Abhishek was also alluding to it in some of the work that they are doing, is the fact that you need to have continuous feedback loops that the governments are going to react to and respond to. So the first thing that we did in Bihar together with Bandhan and the government was to create these dashboards, MIS loops, very, I would say, in important institutional mechanisms to be able to collect data at all levels, but also build this culture of collecting and looking at the evidence at all levels. Now you have the cluster level federation officers who are mentors. If they don't know what are the needs of the communities, of the women that they are servicing, you're not going to be able to coach and mentor them properly. We found through the MIS that there were a lot of, initially, any program is going to have your teething problems. So we found delays in asset transfer, very sort of conservative, even identification of the beneficiaries. We found that there's a lot of gaps in the kind of data that has been collected on the ground. So continuously just monitoring a lot of these processes helped us refine it. It helped give the government a much better handle on what was coming in, what needed to be done, what are the gaps that needed to be fixed. So that was the first step, is just giving more actionable data back to the government, which is very quick feedback loops and process monitoring data. I think the other thing that I would say is needed in this is you need to embed it in the institutional mechanisms and systems that the government has. So we cannot come in and have a fleet of external folks like us who are sitting and creating that data, collecting it, measuring it, monitoring it, and giving it back. It has to be collected by the government for them and through their own teams. And we've been able, I'll give you, we're talking about economic inclusion, but I'll quickly switch gears here to some of the work that we're doing in Tamil Nadu. It's a 11-12-year partnership there, and we've been working with the Department of Statistics and Department of Health to actually train their officers, field officers, in collecting digital data, which was so far on pen and paper exercise, digital data on the, so they approach it from the pensions perspective, but we said if you're going in understanding what are the pensions for the elderly, let's also look at how are they doing in their socioeconomic status, how are they doing in their health-wise, health and well-being. So the Department of Health and Statistics got together, and there's a comprehensive 5,000 household survey now that's being done in different waves. It's about a 7-year study that has been set up by the government, and we've only facilitated that. And we're doing some amount of external validation of that data just to see how it's being, I mean, you need external validation anyway. So just to see what the quality of the data is. Very spot on, very high quality, and the government is now collecting a lot of very valuable information on the lives of the elderly, which erstwhile they weren't aware of. Simple things like what percentage of the elderly get pensions. We found less than 20% in the first wave of those eligible getting pensions. It was quite an eye-opener. We think that families in India a lot of families in India, especially in rural areas, live in joint family systems. We found about 26% of the elderly in Tamil Nadu through this data, and the government found that through their own systems, their recollection, they live alone. 26% live alone, 80% are women. So it's a whole different policy programming that has to be done for them. Now, this data collection is a sustained priority for the government because they're finding a lot of this information valuable in crafting their housing policies, their health and well-being policies. 2 different schemes have now been sort of launched in these communities for, firstly, just last mile connectivity on the health aspects, because we realize a lot of NCDs, a lot of underlying conditions that they're unaware of, and they can't go to hospital to screen. So, I mean, these are some of the ways in terms of how you need to be able to speak to what is important for different stakeholders. And in this case, if you want it to be really scaled and through evidence-based decision making, it has to be actionable, it has to be responsive. And the last thing I'll talk about is sort of how do you institutionalize these processes, build capacity within governments. State actors, they have the people, they just need the right kind of skills and training to be able to really work with the system and improve the systems internally. And everybody really talks about it, but I don't see too many people actually putting any money into this. So we get a lot of funders saying, a lot of people come and say, we will fund your evaluations. But when we talk about capacity building with the government, there's not enough that money is going there. In fact, the governments themselves are ready to put in the money, provided that they have the right kind of actors who are supporting them.
Yeah, thinking about this, how I have reflected and understood evidence in the context of our work is it's like elephant and blind men and women, right? Trying to explore, understand elephant. Someone explores the trunk and says it's a snake. Someone touches the feet and says it looks like a tree, or tail like a rope. So similarly, for how I have understood it is that there is one causal impact, rigorous experimental or non-experimental method. There could be process evaluations for understanding the implementation fidelity. There could be dashboards, as I mentioned, to help frontline workers understand what is happening, whether the project implementation is going as planned. So that is one part related to this. And so important thing to reflect here is that evidence for whom and what decision will it support. Decisions that a frontline worker will take using those tools or using that evidence will be very different from what some senior government officials in MORD will take and things like that. So bringing decision centricity to the forefront is very, very, very important when we think about our work related to evidence generation and scale. That is part one. Then Shobhani ma'am touched a little bit about the institutional architecture and mechanism. So here I would like to share some of the work that ID Insight has been doing in Uttar Pradesh. So we have an embedded partnership with the planning department of Uttar Pradesh. So within planning department, there is an evaluation division, and they are mandated by rules to conduct evaluations of government schemes. Now, these evaluation division and the evaluations they are doing are not very robust. So what we have tried doing is to build capacity of that division. But on top of that, we reflected a little bit around decision centricity. Who would take these decisions and how? So we have created something called REMO under the guidance of PS Planning. Basically, this is Rapid Evidence Monitoring Unit, gathering the best officers from the evaluation unit, and they have been earmarked, tagged to PS Planning's office, and their mandate is that they would do very rapid evaluations. These evaluations not 12-month, 18-month rigorous evaluations, but 8 weeks or 10 weeks evaluations, looking at the program, looking at how it is implemented, looking at implementation fidelity, very quick phone surveys, looking at literature out there and providing rapid feedback. So those type of experiments we are doing. Overall objective is that if they are able to do those things at a sustained level with ID Insight's help, we have created standard operating procedures, invested in capacity building, and if we are able to move out after a period of time, then that is the institutional framework that we are looking for. It is yet to be seen if it will sustain or not, but those are some of the experiments that we are trying.
Vidisha, so we have a QR code scan. Please feel free to scan this if you have any Q&A, and we have a Q&A session in the end. Please.
I'm just going to, remove my 3IE hat and take my broader, evaluation capacity building hat here, and drawing from my experience across quite a few countries. And I fully agree with both what Shobini and Abhishek have said, that, it's at the end of the day, evidence generation and even evidence's use is not on the top of their minds, of a decision maker mind, particularly someone who has many political economy considerations going on, right? And this is a reality and a complexity that we as evidence generators need to live with. We have to embrace it. Having said that, my experience has shown that along with skills capacity, which are very critical and undoubtedly so, what is really important is to understand the system of incentives. What incentives lie in place for someone who is an evidence producer, whose role is an evidence producer within a government system to produce the right kind of evidence, and to a person who is within, a decision maker who is within the government systems, to use that evidence, right? That requires an understanding of the entire systems that are in place and what incentives lie. Now I'm going to switch out of India and I'm going to go to a work that I've been doing in Cambodia, and to really understand, is it a capacity issue, is it a financial issue, that's really stands on the way of effective evidence use, and I'll use the word effective evidence use. We find something very minor, but perhaps which is known very well to people in this room. We asked, those people who are primarily in the evidence production teams, how much time do you actually spend analyzing data? And they analyzing data, and their point was, we want to spend around 50% of our time analyzing data. We are able to spend less than 10%, right? This is a reality we have to live with, and this is the reality of any government system. We can go anywhere in the world, it's the same. It would be similar stories will be heard. What can we do? Can we bring in efficiency enhancing tools that in the 10% time that they are reasonably able to give within their budget, a budgeted allocated time, they can produce more and better evidence? So this is really something that we as a community need to think about. The second point that we also ask decision makers, what are your incentives to use this evidence that is produced? I don't have the time is something that, and I can see Shobini nodding, I don't have the time. How fast can you get it to me? How quickly can you get it to me? And in what form can you get it to me so that I can use the evidence? Those are critical points. Secondly, what will I get out of using an evidence, evidence? Is my promotion dependent on backed on using data and evidence? Perhaps it is, but is it really critical? These are thoughts that, and I don't have an answer to this. I don't have an answer to this, but these are very critical points that one needs to think about as we design capacity support programs, right? We spent, this is in my role in the International Fund for Agriculture Development, we spent years building capacity of the MNE team in one country to do evaluations and all that. We found that the entire team quit because they got better private sector jobs. These are realities. It's a market. And I don't think we have understood how the marketplace for evaluation is working. So I don't have any really great solutions, but I do think that these are points that need to be thought about when we talk about institutionalizing evidence. I also want to reflect a bit on the importance of the ecosystem. The government alone does not function alone. There are partners such as us. There are partners beyond us also who go beyond capacity development, who demand that the government use evidence civil society organizations play a very critical role. The media plays a very critical role. The media is the one that holds up the government to some form of accountability. Uh, if as evaluators, as evidence producers and evidence builders, we are not engaging with these ecosystem players, then I don't think that we will really be able to make any systemic changes. So yeah, I think, broadly, those would be the top things that come to my mind. Yeah. Anything?
Thanks, Vidisha. A lot of interesting points. One, Shobhani ma'am started with saying that evidence generation is right now not necessarily a priority. That's where we are right now. That's the reality. Evidence generation needs to be institutionalized. That's the way to go about. And there have been, Abhishek shared a few examples about how it is done in some of the work that ID Insight has worked on, which has worked. And really interesting points by Bidisha on what are the incentives, what should be the incentives, and even if you focus on capacity building, unintended consequences. What if the team leaves after you train them? Real problem, no answers for that. This is where I'll urge the panel to come up, or not come up, sorry. Share your perspectives on what, while you've touched upon what is happening in terms of capacity building, what are the opportunities that lay ahead in terms of what can be done with the context that we are in. So if you could touch upon that, that would be great.
So I'll draw an analogy when we, so I mean, we've been talking about the challenges, but let me put it in a more sort of realistic sense. When we are all, unless it's close to your home, no one pays attention. So if you're building a house and if you're building a family home, what do you need? You need to have a blueprint. You need to have some plans in place. You need to know how many rooms to build, what the foundation is, all of that, money for different aspects of what you want to do. You put money aside. So you need budgets, you need a plan, you need a blueprint, you need the right kind of people, you need the right kind of skills. And any program is exactly like that. But what happens in many cases is, I mean, not many cases, what happens if you don't have a plan? The plumber comes in and starts laying the pipes without a blueprint. You have the electrician comes in and starts laying the wires wherever he or she feels like. You have, the mason is laying bricks. I've lived in government houses. No two walls were ever straight. Our paintings were all tirha. You have these, and then we used to have, every year my mother would whitewash everything. There was chuna, and we would get it on our clothes. We never, the foundations, we hear all the time of slight tremors and buildings collapsing. Foundations are not strong. So when you think about any program that you are implementing, all of these are the right sort of elements that need to be in place. When you think about opportunities, the very first opportunity is actually our opportunity are our people. We need the right kind of people with the right kind of skills and the mentorship to be able to make any change. We've talked about the cluster level federation officers, very strong women on the ground doing so much work, and largely the power many states have been able to tap their power. Many states, this power is still latent. And we really need to be able to re-energize, refocus, and use this cadre to not just create these, have them as drivers of change in the community, but they are a poster women, and we really need to be able to do a lot more with this group to be able to make that sort of social change, and that's where the opportunity is. And they are creating change in the community because and we've done some work in other spheres where we've seen how when women are coming up in the communities, we worked on some natural experiments with the panchayat leaders who are women and wanted reservation, and we've seen the villages where they were elected on, in subsequent elections, the girls in those villages are much more likely to go to school and finish their schooling. So you see these effects, right? And no one's really capturing all of this because there's an entire sort of spillover effects that are coming into place. That's one opportunity that I see that really it is being recognized, it is being harnessed, and a lot more we need to put our weight behind that. The second I'll talk about is the fact that, and I mentioned this earlier, there is a lot more emphasis on data. There's a lot more emphasis also on putting up the right systems to collect the data within governments. We have administrative data, we have entire digital data systems. People are talking about AI as well. How do we use this responsibly? not to further exclusion, but to make sure that there is the last person is included, the last person is trained, every last person is trained in how to use these responsibly. We've done in the graduation approach, I'm forgetting now which country, we've done an evaluation looking at how do we, if we provide digital skills to the, and the thing with these WhatsApp groups of these women were formed, these the women who were actually receiving the benefits and the asset transfers, WhatsApp groups had been formed. These peer networks, and you talked about peer networks, had been formed as well. And they were sharing information through WhatsApp groups. You had the cluster level federation officers had all the training plans on their phones. The women who actually participated in all of these, their profits were much more than the women who were going, even in the graduation approach, who were going through what we now call business as usual, what the approach is. So leveraging the technology, leveraging digital infrastructure, I think that's another opportunity. Bihar, we've seen how, and all of us have talked about how feedback loops and data and MIS and dashboards are being used now a lot more for feedback and iterative adaptation models. And that's, again, I feel is something that's happening a lot more. We are also seeing convergence. We are seeing decentralization at the cluster level, federation officers level, but we are also seeing convergence across different schemes, the departments coming together. Because one of the biggest issues that not issues, I mean, it's a fact of life, is that everything's very decentralized and there are different departments. Even in economic inclusion, if you look at it, different departments are doing different things. Someone's looking at digital payments separately. Someone is looking at your social protection, then NRLM is looking at livelihoods. So how do we get all of these to come together? Because ultimately it's that one beneficiary who is the recipient of everything, but the different departments are giving it in different shapes and forms. So some amount of convergence, and I see there's an opportunity, and that is happening in several states. And the last is, folks like us coming together, people in this room, you need, while the government is the driver, for any system level change to happen, you need the right kind of actors also supporting the entire movement. And I feel that that's happening quite a bit now.
Thinking about opportunities, I think it's a mixed bag here, in the sense that you need to invest in right champions, which may or may not happen. That is one part of it. And second is that, as Shobni ma'am alluded to earlier, you need right amount of investment, because it is one thing to think about, doing an evaluation of a scheme. It could be an RCT, it could be a process evaluation, but it is very different to be embedded, working with them. It's their data, they are championing it, they are thinking about the questions, they are thinking about what decisions to take based on that data, and you are just playing a supportive role. That is a relationship of trust, and you need a lot of time and investment in that, and for which we need right type of uh, donor support also. That is very, very, very important in this. uh, other thing in terms of opportunities, that if we are able to leverage, you know a lot of focus goes on big schemes, national schemes. If we are able to leverage state level institutions, that I feel is another opportunity, as we've tried, and JPAL has worked in Tamil Nadu. So some of these things are there. And lastly, around deduplication of data, or each scheme trying to collect its own data, some of these states are thinking very seriously about that in the form of state data policies. Maharashtra has come up with one, Odisha has come up with one. They are in different stages of implementation, but once the state data policy is fully envisaged, fully formed, fully functional, including state data authority, that is one huge opportunity where not everyone is not collecting their data in terms of identification. Everyone is not, means data sharing between different department becomes easier and seamless. So those are windows of opportunity, and different states are at different level thinking very seriously about those things.
For India, I think, the opportunities lie in the fact that we are becoming increasingly connected. We are digitally connected. Everyone is on some form of social media and so on. Uh, and this includes even rural India. I think, this time, the 2024, when we were doing the impact evaluation and my teams were in the field, one of the things that we really, that came as a eye opener, I would say, is that how confident women were becoming with using mobile phones, with using technology. So we need to, at some point, call out this myth that women may not necessarily be equipped to use technology. I think with the right training, with the right mentorship, uh, uh, and technology itself is getting so much more simplified that it can be quite transformative for women. So we need to make use of the fact that not only that there's a connect, as Shobani also mentioned, right, and also Abhishek, that people are getting connected through the WhatsApp group. Every SHG woman will have their own SHG group where they're posting, if not anything, hello, how are you, good morning messages, right? um, we met women, and again, my team is here, so please do reach out to them. We have met women who have started enterprises on their own, following instructions from YouTube. So people are using, there is that connectedness, and we have to use this wisely to reach the scale. That and scale for impact. Now there's also the thing that we reach out physically to multiple women, include them in the program. But where does the voltage effect sustain, or does it fizzle out? So these are, I think digital connectivity is very important here. It also alleviates one very important constraint that women face around their own physical mobility. Our study of NRLM in 2024 said that even though we were going back to the same villages after 6 years, the marketplace, the labor marketplace for women was still confined within the village, right? Men could go, and men were traveling outside for work, but women were still confined to the village, right? How then can we bring markets closer to women? Those are questions that we can think about. But that's only for, talking in terms of the capacity building of our CRPDDs who are at the grassroots level, who are part of the evidence architecture. We are seeing a lot more newer women who are younger women who are coming into the SAG. So another interesting finding is about how these self-help groups are actually dynamic groups. They're changing in nature. The newer women are coming in. These are the women who are taking these big productive loans to start their enterprises. We have, women are changing. We are riding the wave, and I think that potential needs to be tapped into. And let's let that's on the grassroots level. At the more, systemic level, the opportunities lie in convergence. The fact that there's a possibility to draw in resources from various other programs for the singular goal of, say, enterprise development, gender justice, and so on. This can be done only by the government. It cannot be done by an organization, an NGO. This is totally something that the government has the advantage on. My third point is about private sector, right? It's I think back when we were starting with the study of NRLM, we barely were able to get private sector to talk about rural livelihoods, rural skilling. We were not able to get that, right? It was CSOs, NGOs, and government that were in this field. Now there are actually private sector players who are getting into this field, who are seeing opportunity of rural transformation. And I think that is another, how to make markets work for evidence generation, evidence use is also, I think, something that we need to think more carefully about. Thanks.
Thank you, Vidisha. We roughly have another less than 5 minutes left, so I'll take some questions from the audience. While there are many questions, I'm going to prioritize. There's one question on, I'm just going to read out the question. How is institutionalizing evidence possible? It is a challenge because within a government system, a policymaker needs to take on many roles. Typically, civil servants get transferred frequently. Real problem. How do we address this?
What we've seen in the last more than 2 decades now of working with governments is that yes, policymakers will get transferred, and Shiku mentioned there are champions. But ultimately, what you need are institutional processes and systems. Things have to go on file, and what we've realized is there's an embedded nature to these things. So you need to create an evidence-based culture. You really need to have one or two. What we've seen from our experiences, 2 or 3 sort of things that need to be in place. Firstly, you need to have a nodal department who is anchoring some of the pieces of the puzzle. So whether it's a data systems, whether it's looking at what are the different programs, ex ante commitment to be able to evaluate. Now, you don't have to always do a randomized evaluation or a full-fledged RCT, but you probably need to have the right data systems, have the right infrastructure. That ex ante commitment of signing up to say, I will look at my data, I am going to evaluate in some shape or form so that I get some valid, credible output from this is important. And that will come if there is something on paper, there's something on file, no one hopefully can overwrite that. So you need to be able to have a nodal department, you need to be able to have the right sort of set of people, whether they are champions or whether there are even those who are mildly interested and will not stand in your way. But you need people at all levels, top through bottom, who are also then supporting that work. The second piece that we've seen in institutionalizing is incentives. And you talked about incentives, and I've talked about it at the beginning as well. Who's the data meant for? Who are you collecting it for? It cannot be garbage in, garbage out. It has to really speak to people. So that canvassing and trust building around some of these aspects is important so that people understand what is it being used for. Otherwise, no one's going to use it, no one's going to look at it, no one's going to collect it. And there is not going to be any change in the mindsets of folks who are looking at this evidence. But Vidisha, I'll let you also sort of pitch in here because I have many more points, but I'm sure we will overlap at some point. So.
Evidence, systematizing evidence is a lot about behavior change, right? And behavior change, of course, comes with incentivizing, and I'll not elaborate any more on that. I think I spoke a lot about it. But there's also something called requirements. And in my experience, if you sometimes it's a habit, and a habit comes when you do it consistently. Often you don't want to do it, and then until it becomes, it is made a requirement. The right questions are asked by the decision makers related where evidence is required to be provided, so that a policy passes, a program passes, right? These are so the relevant questions have to be put in the system for even the policy program to go through. Once that happens, once this has been done consistently, it becomes a habit. And people change. Once they see that with the kind of data input evidence, things become are based on a more solid foundation, the demand generates. So at some point there has to be certain binding constraints that make people bring in, basically, form a habit. And then the habit leads to the demand. I do think there's a lot that can be done in terms of, systems thinking and behavior change when we're talking about institutionalized evidence, and it's just something that we as a group need to think more deeply about. Yeah.
Just one thing related to this is around, when I was hearing you both, I was reflecting a little bit around our work in UP and this Remo thing that I mentioned. So because it is government's own body, and we have a champion who cares about data and evidence, so then relationship of trust builds. Evidence is not to punish anyone, evidence is not to reprimand anyone, but to understand and improve the project. And he's able to, because because planning is one such department that is cross-cutting and is able to reach out to all the other departments. It has mandate related to that. They're able to quickly reach out to counterparts and say, tell them, oh, this is happening. And sometimes what happens is that these very senior officers, they do not have that level of visibility around how the implementation is happening. So that triggers and encourages that culture of using evidence. So that is one example we were able to see closely in Uttar Pradesh.
Thanks, Abhishek. Well, there are many questions. Unfortunately, in the interest of time, we will not be able to take them. Any closing remarks before we close the session? Anything that you wanted to share?
I feel like we've spoken a lot, Prakash, but some of the work that the NAJ is doing is also very interesting. And I just wanted to ask you actually, what are you finding from some of the work that you've done for exactly the questions that you've asked us?
Yes. At NUTCH, I'll start with something called the NUTCH spirits that we have. These are the guiding principles for us. There are 4 principles. The first principle is purpose at the center, which to loosely translate, it means that the program participants that we work with are in the front and center. Any decisions that we take is keeping the program participants in the front and center, which means for us, what is important is to scale impact. So impact comes first, and then we scale, and which is why we take evidence building very seriously. So the fact that we have an in-house impact team, which is slightly independent in the sense that while many organizations have a M&E team, while they mostly do monitoring, we do have an impact team where we independently look at things, ask these critical questions from the lens of generating evidence, so that at least within the organization, the right kind of decision makers have the necessary information to take the decisions that are needed when we are scaling with in multiple regions with multiple partners. So it starts from there. The way it gets implemented is different in the sense that's where we partner with Abhishek, with ID Insight, where we have collaborations with JPAL and many other organizations, and to generate the right kind of evidence so that we don't fool ourselves, we stay true to ourselves and take the right kind of decisions. So while, in some of the questions, there were questions on sustainability of the program outcomes. In fact, not many organizations do it. In fact, NUTCH, for the Economic Inclusion Program, the very first cohort that graduated almost 3 years ago, we have done a sustainability study, and we will be doing an end-line evaluation with the very first cohort that will be graduating soon in the government-led implementation and things like that. So be it a impact evaluation, be it a process evaluation or rapid evaluations that we'll soon be focusing on, and also building the in-house capabilities in terms of how do we build capabilities so that we are able to strengthen the monitoring systems and generate the right kind of evidence and provide the necessary information to the leadership to take effective decisions. That's where we are placed right now, and that's why all these big collaborations with JPAL, where we are learning a lot, with ID Insight, they've come in and done process evaluations, and that's where we're placed right now. Great discussions. I don't know if I can summarize all the different points that have emerged, but the takeaways for me are, number one, evidence generation needs to be institutionalized. It starts with, if I have to put it, evidence generation needs to be utility focused. For who, for what purpose, needs to be very clear, and then it needs to be institutionalized, like Abhishek put it. Find the champions, build trust, and understand the requirements soon. And like Vidisha put it, identify the incentives. Identify what is needed and provide the right kind of incentives and the necessary capacity building so that they're able to do the work that is needed and also continue doing even after the program ends. With that, I thank you, the panelists especially, and also the audience for the great session. Thank you.